If you don't poop on a regular basis, it can affect how your skin looks. For women, it can make them estrogen dominant, so they can get more breast tenderness around the cycles. They might be more predisposed to getting fibroids as they grow older, but also just the way your skin looks, breaking out in acne. I've seen eczema improve just by getting someone to poop more regularly. And even asthma can have, ups and downs based on how much you're pooping and detoxing.
Hey everyone, at this point we likely don't need to tell you that gut health is the gateway to optimal well-being. But gut health is personal and no two guts are the same, which is why we have board-certified internist and functional medicine practitioner Dr. Vincent Pedre back on the show to discuss everything you need to know about optimizing your own gut microbiome. From the best fermented foods to recovering after antibiotics to the exciting new updates in stool testing and fecal transplants. Vincent has undergone years of research and clinical experience as a functional gut health expert, and if you often feel overwhelmed by the lion's share of gut health advice, then this episode is for you. Keep listening to hear actionable tips and underrated daily hacks. Vincent, welcome back. Great to see you.
Great to see you again.
So it's been about a year since we talked, and besides your incredible new book, The Gut Smart Protocol, I'm curious, what's new in your world in terms of all things gut health?
Oh, and I think I've been in the gut health realm for over a decade now. Actually, like 15 years at least, since I really dove into functional medicine. And over that time, the landscape has changed a lot. And I think one of the big questions is, what is the right diet for your gut and for your microbiome? And I've certainly had experiences since the last time we spoke, which I think was a bit ago. I was in Africa right before the pandemic, and had the opportunity to stay with the Hadza, the hunter-gatherers, one of the few hunter-gatherer groups that still exist on Earth, that are living the way that their ancestors lived, hunting and gathering. And what was really fascinating about it, and why I got so excited when I had an opportunity to be one of 10 people chosen to go on this trip, is that they've studied the stool of the Hadza. They've done PCR, DNA shotgun analysis. And what they found is that their microbiome is incredibly diverse, really diverse. And there are probably a lot of factors there. But why is that important? Why would we even care that their microbiome is diverse as it is? And the reason is that the Hadza have no diabetes, they have no heart disease, they have no dementia, they have no obesity, they have no cancer. So they don't have the diseases that we associate with the modern Western world that maybe we think. And there are a lot of things that have been good for humanity, that have been discovered in medicine in the last 100 years. Even the discovery of antibiotics has prolonged lifespan. But even with that, we see the lifespan has not really cracked much longer than it's like 70, like low 70s in the US. Hasn't really changed in, half a century. And so, what can we learn from the Hadza? And how can we filter that into the way that we live our lives? Because we're not going to go out and become hunter-gatherers. But there are certain key takeaways that I talk about in my book. And this was one big influence in shifting, I think a shifting paradigm of how we understand what creates health and what creates a robust, diverse gut microbiome. And that is a key word. If anything, I want people to remember who listen to this podcast: diversity, microbial diversity. That is the holy grail. Because the more diverse your gut microbiome is, and we can go into some studies that have looked at that, the lower your inflammation is. And inflammation is the common denominator, the fuel behind every chronic degenerative disease out there. But I want to go back to, a very important tenet of functional medicine, which is eat the rainbow. I see that multicolored painting behind you and I'm thinking, that's like a representation of all the different
We live
colors.
in Florida now. We're embracing the alligators. They're
Yeah,
our
I like
friends.
it. And the coloring, I think the colors here are always much brighter than in New York. And so we learn eat the rainbow, and that's how you create microbial diversity. And yet my experiences and some studies that have come out are actually challenging that point of view that has been such a fundamental, foundational belief in functional medicine that you need to eat this wide variety of colors to get all of the antioxidants and phytonutrients that we need in order to ensure that our microbiome is more diverse and robust. And yet, what do the Hadza eat? They eat root vegetables that they dig from the ground that are brown and white. They eat honey. And when I say honey, I mean they're eating everything, the honeycomb, the honeybees. Now, that might sound a little gross, but the honeybees in Africa, the ones that live around the area in Tanzania where they migrate, they're tiny. They look like little flies. They don't look like bees the way that we think of them. And actually, I went out hunting and foraging with them and ate a root vegetable that had just been freshly dug from the ground. And then they came over and offered me honey. And as they were pouring the honey, there were honeybees stuck in the honey and some pieces of honeycomb. And was like, I'm in Africa. I'm going to do as the Hadza do. And they also eat baobab fruit, which again is just browns and whites. So not a lot of.
What's the fruit
It's
called?
called a baobab. Baobab.
Baobab. Can you even? I've never heard of that. Is that even?
BAB. It's a really beautiful tree. It's the one that you associate with the Lion King in Africa. It's these beautiful trees that have these canopies, and they create this fruit that is very high in fiber. And they actually use it when they're weaning children off of breast milk. They mash up the inside of the baobab fruit and make it into a mash. So that's part of their diet, along with hunting medium to small to medium sized animals and wild berries that just grow in the bush. So it's not a very diverse diet, and yet they have an incredibly diverse gut microbiome. Probably some parasites in there, who knows? And it got me thinking, like, what is it really that creates diversity? Is if they can have diversity and they are not eating the rainbow of colors, the vegetables. And I think there's certain factors that we can learn from them. They have not been exposed to antibiotics. So the antibiotics have not gone in there and decimated. I mean, the average person is on multiple rounds of antibiotics. I was on 20 plus rounds of antibiotics only during my teenage years. Actually, preteen to teen, like age 10 all the way to 19, 20 plus rounds of antibiotics, 2 to 3 times per year. And that was just common practice. The other thing is that they are out in nature. They are touching the dirt. They are getting dirty. They are not using hand sanitizers. They are not using antibacterial soaps. And I think that is another really big factor that's kind of an onslaught on the gut of people in the Western world, and why we're seeing that just IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, affects up to 11% of the world population. That is 896 million people worldwide suffering from a reversible gut health issue that has been triggered by things like overexposure to antibiotics, oversanitization, pesticides, all these things. So as I was writing this book, I started just having a shift in my thinking of what is it that creates robust wellness for us, or well-being. I know as you talk about in your book. And part of it is that we need to get out into nature. we need to expose ourselves to the elements, to hormetic stressors. I mean, if you can have a garden, like have an organic garden and get your hands dirty, like get your hands into the soil, like expose your microbiome to this diverse microbiome that's out there. And yes, still, I want to reference some other studies that have been really influential in the way that I'm kind of thinking about gut health now, from the point of view of what not only what's good for the gut, but what's going to increase microbial diversity and what's going to lower inflammation in the body. So around the time, so I was researching and writing my book, Stanford University published a study. They took a small cohort of people. It was about 18 per study arm. 73% of them were women, and it was a wide age group. And they looked at what are the effects of a fiber-rich diet? So eating lots of greens, lots of prebiotic foods versus a high fermented foods diet. And what does that mean? Because most people, when you ask them, well, how many servings of vegetables do you get in a day? The average answer, sadly, that I've heard as a doctor over the last 20 years is 2, maybe 2 to 3 servings. But ideally, we should be getting 5 to 8 servings per day. Even might even be higher, like 9 servings per day. So in this study, the fiber-rich group was asked to eat 5 to 8 servings per day. And the fermented foods group, which was eating pre-intervention, they were eating about less than a half cup on average per day of fermented foods. They were asked to increase that to 6 cups per day. Now they had a 4-week ramp up because whenever you're increasing fiber or ferment, it's going to be kind of rough on your body if you do it. If you go from half a cup to suddenly having 6 cups per day, it's going to be a major freak out in there in your gut. So they had a 4-week ramp up and then a 6 weeks where they maintained at that high level. And they did a pre-test where they looked at microbial diversity and they looked at all the inflammatory markers. And then they did a post-test at the end of this 10-week period. And actually the full study was 17 weeks long because they had a ramp up and then the study period. And then they had a period where they allowed people to choose how they wanted to eat. And so what they found in this short study was that surprisingly, again, so this ties back into the hot stuff, ties back into thinking about, is it fiber? Is it eating the rainbow that's going to increase microbial diversity? And what they found was that it didn't. Now, it could be that the study wasn't long enough, that maybe we needed more time on a high fiber diet to start to see that part of the microbiome change. But in that short period, what they did find is that a high fermented foods diet increased microbial diversity in that group and lowered 19 inflammatory markers, including they were looking at intracellular cytokine activation. And they found that all those levels reduced. Now they decided to go back and look at the fiber-rich group and see, well, are there differences within this group? And are those differences, can we account for any changes in behavior of the immune system? And they actually were able to see that the fiber-rich group, they could stratify it into a low diversity, medium diversity, and a high diversity group within that group of fiber-rich participants. And what they found was, if at the lowest scale of diversity, in the fiber-rich group, they actually saw an increase in immune activation. At the highest diversity, they saw the reverse. They saw a decrease in immune activation. So what do we conclude from that? I think what it's leading us to, and I can tie it into actually another study that was done looking at diet and mental health. What it's leading us to is that a fiber-rich diet does have some effect. It has an immunomodulatory role, and it's going to have a more positive effect the more diverse your gut microbiome is at baseline. So We want to be, it's not, I hate that they pitted fiber rich against fermented, high fermented. I think there should have been a third group that maybe was a control where there was no diet intervention. So we could see these two against that as well. But I think, it starts to draw up some really great questions here because I don't think it's about fiber versus ferments. I think it's really about the combination of the two. And guess what? A year later, another group decided to do a study and they took 45 healthy volunteers. This was during the pandemic, so they had a little trouble recruiting enough people, but they got 45 people, divided them into two groups. It was a 4-week study. They were measuring, and these were healthy people recruited. Average age was in the 30s, but they ranged from 18, I think, all the way to like in the mid 50s, early 60s. And they used a standardized stress score that they had everybody fill out this questionnaire before they started the intervention. And then they repeated that stress score at the end. The only difference was, so here we did have a control group. The control group was just given, general dietary advice, like, reduce your sugar intake, avoid alcohol, like, avoid processed foods. So they just got general advice. The other group, the intervention group, was told how much fiber to eat. They were asked to eat 5 to 8 servings per day. They were asked to incorporate some grains into the diet, and they were also asked to incorporate 2 to 3 servings of fermented foods. So not as high as the Stanford study where they went to 6 servings, which is quite a lot, mostly yogurt and vegetable brine. So this group was only 2 to 3 servings, but it was matched with also increasing their fiber intake. And so, it's a great comparison because now we have a study where we combined high fiber, increased fermented foods, and what impact does that have on the brain and on stress? And what they found was, I think you're not going to be surprised, that the fiber-rich group with the increase in fermented foods had a drop. It was a 32% drop in their stress score versus the placebo group, which only had a 17% drop. So they were almost double the other group. And that was only in a 4-week period. So and that ties into gut-brain connection and, is the gut perhaps the key and the avenue to healing mental health disorders like depression, like anxiety? I mean, worldwide, depression is the most common mental health disorder, affecting 11 to 15% of the world population. So that's over 1 billion people worldwide suffering from a mental health issue that could be tied to the gut and the way that they're eating and the types of foods that they're choosing. And there was actually another study that came out in Nature in December of last year. This came out obviously after I finished writing my book. And it was about looking at depressed people. And this was a big study because they had over 1,000 participants, and they were studying their gut microbiome and seeing, are there differences in the gut microbiome in people who report depressive symptoms? And they found that there were. And some of the differences involved shifts in the types of bacteria that increase inflammation in the body. And actually, there was one. It was interesting because the types of bacteria that were involved in this, they almost sound like Disney villains. It was Ergothella and Hungatella and Selamonas and Lachnoclostridium. And one of them, for example, Hungatella produces a substance called trimethylamine, TMA. Now, TMA is a metabolic product that certain bacteria in the gut will make when you eat L-carnitine, which is from sources like red meat, or phosphatidylcholine, which comes from shellfish like lobster, shrimp, all those shellfish. And so Hungatella will create TMA. Now, TMA by itself is not problematic. What's problematic is what happens when this bacterial product gets absorbed and goes into the portal circulation, which first runs the blood from the gut through the liver, where it gets metabolized. And depending on your genetic uniqueness, you may have a very high active enzyme called flavin monooxygenase, or FMO. That FMO is going to take that TMA, trimethylamine, and it's going to turn it into TMAO, trimethylamine N oxide. Now, I was researching this when I researched my book in relation to heart disease, because trimethylamine converted TMAO increases the risk for heart attack and stroke by double, regardless of whether you have a good cholesterol or not. You could have the best cholesterol. If you have high TMAO, it's increasing your risk for stroke and heart attack, independent. So that's a gut-heart, gut cardiovascular connection. What I didn't know, which they talked about in this study, is how TMAO also increases risk for depression. Again, tied to the gut, and 13 different bacterial taxa that they came up with that they saw are different between people. And then you start wondering, like, can this be is this a trait that we can transfer through the gut microbiome? So they took the stool from depressed humans, depressed people, and they did an experiment where they gave that stool. So they put it in with germ-free mice, and germ-free mice will eat poop. It's a little gross, but they'll eat poop, and they make for a really great experiment, because they start off with no gut microbiome, and then you expose them to these bugs from the poop of depressed subjects in this particular study, and then you watch their behavior. And what they found was that when they were exposed to the poop from these depressed subjects, that their behavior changed, and they started exhibiting depression style behavior, that I guess they have certain markers that they look at in mice. So then, it's like so depression is a transferable trait through a fecal transplant.
Well, it's fascinating, and without question, I think the gut-brain connection is real. There's a lot of strong research suggesting that a lot of mental health issues are essentially a form of metabolic dysfunction. We've had Chris Palmer on the show. It's definitely an emerging area that is really exciting for people struggling. I want to bring it back to the tribe for a moment. I think it's fascinating. You mentioned they have the root vegetables, honey, the essentially fruit and berries, and then they have some animal-based foods. I'm curious, what percentage is it fruits and veggies versus meat?
It's a good question, and it actually changes throughout the year depending on what's available. Depending on the season. So honey's only available during a certain part of the year, and the berries also are only available during certain parts of the year. The root vegetables, I think they're able to kind of keep year round. So, and the animal meat depends on whether they can find or they don't. They're out hunting. So I think it's changing all the time. So it can be, it could be 50-50 plant animal, or it could be less, depending on what's available. And they've looked at the amount of fiber that they take in, just as a comparison. They typically eat 40 to 50 grams of fiber per day, whereas the average American eats around 10 to 15 grams of fiber. The recommendation is about 25 to 35 grams.
And I'm assuming, given their location, no fish.
No fish, just land animals and birds.
Birds.
Yeah, they hunt birds.
So what type of
I mean, some of them are just these little birds, but it was, I mean, these guys, it was amazing how skilled of hunters they are, and how quickly they move, and how quickly they can spot something. And they could shoot a little bird off of a tree with their bow and arrow, which and they don't look like they're like super built, like strong. and they gave us a bow and arrow to see, or just the bow to see if we could pull the string back. It was nearly impossible. It is so tightly wound. And then the chief who was having us do that was laughing. And then he takes it and he just goes like this, just with no, what seems like no effort, but they've built the back muscles that can just pull this back. And he was teaching us how to use it, but it was, God, for it not being used to those types of movements. I mean, they are incredibly agile people.
And so you mentioned they're obviously in nature all the time, and the antibiotics are non-existent, and antibiotics are a reality here, unfortunately. Uh, myself, I had oral surgery about a year ago, had to take antibiotics. Everyone, I think you're absolutely right, and they're overprescribed, but sometimes they happen. And so, with that said, for someone who has to do a round or two of antibiotics, what do you recommend to make sure our guts properly recover?
Yeah, I have a variety of viewpoints on that. From, if you know that you're going to go on antibiotics, I'm a big believer in taking probiotic type things that can help protect the gut and the gut microbiome. One of them is a friendly yeast, Saccharomyces boulardii.
Sac B.
Yeah, and you can take that while you're on antibiotics. And usually I bridge it for much longer. So if someone's on just a short course of antibiotics, I'll have them take that for at least 30 days. There's a lot of great studies on Saccharomyces boulardii and its effect on improving gut permeability, on protecting the gut barrier, on helping resolve food-related diarrhea like gastroenteritis. I also will usually have someone take a probiotic post. But I'm also a big proponent of incorporating fermented foods after you're done with the antibiotics. And again, just tying it into how I started, the antibiotic is going to reduce microbial diversity. And what we know now is it takes 6 months to recover, for your gut microbiome to recover from a 5-day Z-Pack. So just 5 days of antibiotics takes 6 months to recover. For 5 days of Cipro, which is very commonly prescribed to women for urinary tract infections, it takes the gut 12 months to recover.
So, what about doxycycline, which is a common antibiotic?
Same thing.
So, like 10 days would be 5 days, 6 months.
Yeah, but just think, when people are going on doxycycline, they're usually going on a longer course. It's 2 weeks, 3 weeks, sometimes longer term. Some people are treated with low dose doxycycline for acne, and so they're constantly causing, messing up with their gut microbiome. So I'm really big proponent of, you know, not just, incorporating the right supplements, but also making sure that you're doing the right things in the diet to support your gut, especially post antibiotics, with ferments, with bone broth, with the right combination of vegetables.
So, in terms of fermented foods, what are some of your favorites?
I'm big on sauerkraut. That's one of my, and I think, it's a preference thing. Sauerkraut, yogurt. I don't do dairy, so it's coconut yogurt for me. Those are some of the big ones. But, I also sometimes will deviate from this. And it's something that I talk about in my book about intuitive eating and using your intuition to personalize your eating for yourself, because sometimes your body may tell you that you need something and you don't know why logically it's telling you that, but your body has a certain level of wisdom that needs to be listened to. And I did that. I'm always willing to deviate from dogma. And even in my book, it has a lot of personalized gut healing plan. People can take a quiz and find out what their gut type is, and then based on that, it tells you how to eat. But I still talk a lot about developing that inner intuition, because, for example, during the pandemic, I went and stayed in Guatemala for 2 weeks. And at the end of the trip, I got incredibly sick, like super ill, to the point where I was basically like running back and forth to the toilet. And turned out that I got Giardia.
Ooh.
And by the time I got back to the US, I managed, thankfully, to get through the flights and got back to New York, diagnosed myself, started on antimicrobials. I had to take an antiparasitic. There was no choice. And like I said, look, I'm not anti-antibiotics. I'm just anti the over prescribing of antibiotics and the overuse of antibiotics. But antibiotics used judiciously are really important. I felt horrible. The minute I took my first doses, I started feeling better. And as I was recovering from that, I got a ping. And this was the middle of winter when I don't ever touch dairy because dairy will make me more mucousy and more likely to catch viruses. And this is in the middle of the pandemic. And I just got a ping that I needed to drink kefir, and it couldn't be coconut kefir or cashew milk, that it had to be real kefir, organic kefir from grass-fed cows. And that's what I did. And I got better really quickly with kefir and bone broth.
That's amazing. I think with regards to dairy, I'm curious what your view is. Mine's evolved to, I think with dairy, you kind of know intuitively, does this work for me or not? And there's some people where they have a whiff of it, they get bloated. Other people can eat a pint of grass-fed yogurt and be totally fine. And that's how my view has evolved. You kind of know if dairy works for you or not. And obviously if it does, opt for the grass-fed.
I think also that dairy could work for you at certain times of the year, and at other times of the year, it's not going to work for you as well. So I've become a seasonal dairy eater because I do love cheese, and I love certain dairy related things like desserts and things. But I avoid dairy fall, winter, spring because after years of experimentation, I realized it increases my risk for getting a virus. And in the spring, it triggers allergies for me. So when I cleaned out my diet and I stopped dairy in fall, winter, spring, stopped all those things, and less likely to get sick when I'm around sick people. But in the summer, I'll let myself have dairy. And again, I think it's an important, not just to know what your gut type is and what you can tolerate, but to also become really aware that not all symptoms that are being triggered by your gut are going to be in your gut. For example, if you have dairy and you get a little bit congested after you have the dairy, but if you're not paying attention because you're not really tuned into your body, you don't have body awareness, you might think that, oh, I just got congested. Maybe there's dust in the air or something. You're not creating the association. And it's so important to start to see those patterns because it can be super subtle, but that little shift in how your sinuses feel after you have dairy could be a sign that it's actually causing more damage than helping. And it's better to avoid it.
100%. It's one of the reasons why I'm such a big fan of mindfulness and meditation and yoga, because those practices really help you tune in to your body. You don't hear a lot of people, go from a 20-minute meditation or a 90-minute yoga class and run to McDonald's for a Big Mac. You just become more in tune.
That was something I noticed when I was in my yoga, was kind of the bridge that got me through medical school. Yoga, meditation, breath work through medical school, and then through residency training as a doctor, which, as you know, is pretty rough. Sometimes 100+ hour weeks. And I noticed that they've done studies where they've shown that sleep deprivation increases the cravings for sugar, for refined carbs, for processed foods. And it definitely happened to me, where especially the more sleep deprived I was, the more I wanted sugar, like bread, pizza, really things. This is before I was aware of how all these things were damaging my body. But when I went to yoga class and I left the yoga class, all I craved was plant-based foods. I had no desire for refined carbs, for sugar. I needed to have something really clean. It was like my body wisdom was speaking and I could hear it and I knew exactly what I wanted in that moment.
Yeah, it's funny when I was practicing yoga like every day in New York City, going to yoga classes every day. There was a time I experimented with being vegan and almost raw. I will say that it does not work for me.
It doesn't work for everyone, and I think that's a really important thing to think, because right now we're in such an explosion of information and information sharing, and we get these trends that suddenly hit, like keto, vegan, paleo, vegetarian, and you think, well, it sounds like it's good for everyone, and that's one thing that I wanted to demystify in my book, because what I found over the years of working with gut patients is that no two guts are the same. So how can their diets be the same? They can't. And you've got to personalize the approach, because what I had over the years is these, you know, gut patients that were coming in with horrible gut health, but they were eating perfectly their kale salads, their raw foods, but not realizing how damaging that was for a gut that was disordered and leaky, and microbiome that was dysbiotic, and their gut couldn't handle all of that raw food.
It's such an important point. We talk about nutrition all the time here. We share so many different points of view, and it's all interesting. And people listening should take it in and make some notes. But at the end of the day, none of these studies matter. It's all about the N of one, you, because we are all unique. Soak it all in, but you gotta really focus on you.
There's no one size fits all, honestly. And I know you've interviewed a lot of different perspectives, and they come in and it's like, this is the best thing, like the carnivore diet and this. And that's what I wanted to take in my book and say, no, there is no one size fits all. We need to stratify you by asking a certain set of questions that are going to help me understand, based on gut-related issues, gut issues, but also gut-related health issues, where you stand in your gut health, because it reverberates and it affects every system in the body. And then that can help us know what is the best way for you to eat. Because if you have severe gut issues, you just heard me talk about how great fermented foods are and how we should be incorporating fermented foods into the diet. But if you have severe gut issues, you cannot have ferments. You're not ready for them.
So I want to encourage everyone to pick up the book so they can go through all of the questions you have. But what are some of the questions, if you can share a few, so that folks can ask themselves, give themselves a little bit of a reality check on how they're doing with their gut health?
Yeah, I mean, some of them are really simple questions about the frequency and intensity of symptoms. Like, do you get heartburn? Do you suffer from constipation? Do you get an upset stomach? Very gut-centric symptoms. But then I'll ask, do you have allergies? Do you have asthma? Do you have autoimmune disease? Do you have Hashimoto's? Have you gained weight in the last couple of years? I find that it's very difficult to lose weight. These other questions, they sound like, wait a second, why are you asking me about this? This doesn't have anything to do with my gut, but actually it has everything to do with the gut and the gut microbiome. And they're all revealing to me, based on the severity score, whether you have leaky gut or not, and how disordered your gut microbiome is, and how much healing is going to need to happen in order to get you back to a really good place.
And what's your take on frequency of bowel movements?
At least daily. And it's got to be a satisfying full poop, because you could be going daily but not emptying completely. And if that's the case, even though you're going daily, you're still constipated because you're retaining poop. But at least once a day. And some people, honestly, they can go more than once a day. Some people have a very strong gastrocolic reflex. When you eat and your stomach feels full, it sends a signal to your rectum to empty. So some people can go up to 3 times a day after every meal. But at least once a day is important. And no, it's not normal to go 2 or 3 times per week only. And I see a lot of people out there who think that that's normal because that's the way their bodies have operated for years. So they just think, well, this must be the way that it works for everyone. Well, you pooping is essential to detoxing the body. And the longer you retain your poop, the more likely that toxins that have been packaged and expelled and ready to be, moved out of your body are going to have more time to recirculate and get reabsorbed back into your body.
I think it's such an important point. I go back to me 20 years ago, and I was, that bloated, pooping 2 to 3 times a week, and I just thought it was normal. And fast forward today, I'm daily, and if I don't go daily, and if I don't feel that emptying feeling, I don't feel good. It definitely feels like I need to get something out of me.
It weighs you down, it weighs down your energy. It can affect how your skin looks. If you don't poop on a regular basis, for women, it can make them estrogen dominant. So they can get more breast tenderness around the cycles. They might be more predisposed to getting fibroids as they grow older. But also just the way your skin looks, breaking out in acne. I've seen eczema improve just by getting someone to poop more regularly. And even asthma can have, ups and downs based on how much you're pooping and detoxing.
100%. I've personally seen I will get a little bit of eczema if I don't poop. And it's rare because I generally am pretty regular. But if I don't, I'll notice that. It's fascinating. So on the subject of poop, talk about the mice eating the poop, and feels like we've been talking about fecal transplants for a long time. Where are we on fecal transplants? Is this really a thing?
Officially, where we're at right now is that the FDA recognizes fecal transplants as a treatment for people with recalcitrant C. diff infection in the gut, where it's not responding to antibiotics. Now, what we've learned from that are some really interesting things. So there was a case study reported where a mother had C. diff and she ended up having her daughter become the donor, the stool donor, so that she could recover from the C. diff. She wasn't responding to antibiotics. Now, the daughter had polycystic ovarian syndrome and insulin resistance. And remember what I said earlier about the mice getting the inheritable trait through the gut microbiome of depression, which you would think like that's not something that can be transferred. Well, in this case, the mother who was not pre-diabetic, was not insulin resistant, after she got the stool transplant from the daughter, developed insulin resistance, blood sugar problems, metabolic issues, and started gaining weight. So then we realized, okay, well, you've got to screen people who are, if you're getting stool donors for fecal transplant, you actually have to put them through a whole screening, make sure they don't have communicable disease, make sure they don't have metabolic syndrome, insulin resistance, polycystic ovarian syndrome, because these traits can be transferred through that. So one, where are we with fecal transplants? The places that are doing them worldwide, so there are clinics in the Bahamas, in London. They do very careful screening of the stool donors to make sure that they're healthy. So that's one, very important. There's also talk about autologous fecal transplant, and this may be something that becomes somewhat of a trend in the next coming years, where when you're healthy, you donate some of your stool, get it freeze dried, put into capsules, held for you, and you then take it when you have to go on antibiotics, when you have a traveler's diarrhea, but now you're giving yourself back your own stool. Now, this is assuming that you're healthy, because most people have been exposed to multiple rounds of antibiotics, pesticides, stress, all the things that probably make your foundational gut microbiome. But it might be something that parents might want to start thinking about for their children when they're young and healthy, like having them, bank their stool and have it for those cases where they can then take their own stool. But there's actually another company that creates fecal transplant capsules, And their target audience, and they've had a lot of successes in the autism community and using fecal transplants for autistic children, but through capsules. Instead of having to do an enema and that whole complicated thing, you can take it in the form of freeze-dried stool and capsules. So it's an evolving science, and the question is going to be, are we going to allow this to evolve in this country? Or are you going to have to go to Mexico, the Bahamas, because the FDA, because it's encapsulated, might want to classify it as a drug, which then creates a very large hurdle of research and gates that will be very difficult to get it approved, because it would take a lot of money and a lot of research studies for that. So, but I think that, for chronic gut issues like Crohn's, like inflammatory bowel disease, there can be a benefit there. And there's a clinic in London, and that also has a location in the Bahamas that does that specifically for people with those inflammatory colitis. And some people get better. Some people do get better with them.
Do you recall the name of the clinic?
I think it's called the Tay House Clinic. Yeah, TAY.
And stool testing, I hear a lot of mixed results on that in terms of accuracy. What's your take on stool testing these days?
I think it's all over the place. And just like any other test that we use in medicine, there's a certain level of sensitivity and specificity, or you can think of it in more simple terms as the accuracy of the test. Every test is a window into the body. And the way I see it is, when we use tests, it's like if the person it's kind of like this interlay. And the way I see things is, you have the person, you have their story. So we never want to discount the symptoms and the story that the person tells us as a health practitioner. Because what a lot of people do is they separate the person from the test results. And if the test results are normal, they look at the person and they tell them, well, everything's fine. But doctor, I'm tired, my joints are achy, blah, blah, blah. But your tests are fine, so you're okay. Come back in a year when, if you're still feeling the same, we'll do the tests again. That's how a normal visit with a Western doctor often goes. But for me, a lot of it is like, well, did you do the right tests? Did you look in the right places? Maybe there are things you didn't test. But I always think that instead of the person in the test, you interlay them. So the tests are like transparencies that you're putting on top of the person, and you're integrating that information, and you're seeing, well, the test says this. Does this make sense with what the person is presenting with? Or is there another test that I should look at because this person is feeling this way? I mean, there's so many ways to do stool analysis, 16S RNA, which I think has certain limitations because they only look for a certain range of species. I personally think shotgun DNA sequencing is better because it's going to look at everything there. But then the flip side of that is that it tells you everything. And then you're like, well, what does all this mean? Because we still don't fully understand. And this is what a lot of companies are looking for out there is there a microbial signature? Can we look at a microbial signature that is representative of leaky gut? Is there a microbial signature that is representative of small intestinal bacterial overgrowth? Is there a microbial signature that's connected to autoimmunity and autoimmune disease? Is there one for depression, like that study that was done and published in Nature at the end of last year, where they saw there were 13 taxa bacteria that were associated either high or low with depressed individuals. So I think we're still understanding those pieces, but there's a lot more information that you can get from a stool study. You can look at inflammatory markers like calprotectin that reflects white blood cell inflammatory activity. You can look at eosinophilic protein X, which might be elevated if your eosinophils are high, which can happen if you have a parasite. You can look for parasites. You can look for yeast. You may or may not find them. I have an acupuncturist friend who sends stool analysis to Nigeria and Africa, where they do very detailed microscopic analysis of the stool. and sometimes find things that are missed in our normal stool studies. There's limitations to doing stool cultures, and certainly the DNA sequencing has again opened our world to seeing more than we could ever see before, because in a stool culture it was almost impossible to culture anaerobes, the bacteria that do not live off of oxygen. They're impossible to culture. But when you do DNA sequencing, then you can find their DNA. So it's given us a view into this hidden world that's inside of us. But I think there's still a lot to learn from those tests. And I know there's a lot of direct to consumer tests that tell you, send us your stool and we're going to tell you what you can eat. And I've had patients do those tests, and sometimes the information conflicts with what the patient knows is good or bad for them. The study might say you can eat this food, but the patient knows, when I eat this, I don't feel well. So I think there's still, we have to be really careful about assigning too much dogma to these results, because I think we're still evolving in our understanding of what they actually mean.
So, in terms of just analyzing the bacteria, are there certain providers you tend to recommend?
I've switched over the years, and for example, I've used Genova Diagnostics for a long time, and then because of the way the reports are done and the breadth of the report and the information I get, I've leaned now more towards Vibrant America and looked at their type of stool reporting. There's also another lab I think called Diagnostic Solutions, the GI map. But that one has its limitations because it's 16S RNA. So it's not looking at the full breadth of what's inside of there. They're looking at what they think is important. But I honestly think with any of these, again, that's why you have to interlay the patient's story, because you might do a stool test and it might not show that there is yeast in the stool, but the patient's story is very consistent with yeast overgrowth. So, like any good doctor, and dating back to William Osler, one of the fathers of modern medicine, you treat the patient, not the test result. You always treat the patient. It's always important. I think this patient-centered medicine, personalized medicine, that's a really important way to go. And that was something that I felt very conflicted with in when I was training in the hospital, because they would talk about, like, well, 13% of people in the study responded well to this medication, so we're going to put you on this medication because we think it's going to help you. And I'm like, wait, but what about this person? Is it really right for them? Like, can we ask that? Because maybe they're the 70 some percent or the 80 some percent where it doesn't work for the 50%. What is their individuality, and is it right for them? Or, I would hear doctors say, well, this works for 55% of the people. I don't know why it's not working for you. Like, well, it's not personalized medicine. You're just like taking a research study and saying, this is you. I'm going to stamp this on your forehead, but you're not that study. You are you. You're separate from that. And your result may not be the result they got in the study.
So, in closing, what are you excited about in the field of medicine? It's a big question.
I mean, for one, I think personalization, which is what my book is about, is really identifying the uniqueness of each individual and meeting them where they're at, and then helping them on their healing journey. Because if you're here, you have to start walking from here. If you're here, you go from here. So really meeting them where they're at. I think I'm also really excited about how much yoga, meditation, mindfulness, breath work has become more of our shared consciousness. It's like really percolated, and it's no longer this thing that's out here, which is where it was in 1995, when at the age of 21 years old, I discovered breath work, meditation, and yoga. And I was doing it when a big part of the world was not, it was certainly not the in thing to do. And now it's become so in that I think now we can really have conversation about how this also is a modifier of how we are. And that's why I included it in my book, The Gut Smart Protocol, because you cannot out diet and you can out supplement a stressed out lifestyle. The stress also has to be addressed, and you do everything, but it's a non-negotiable. And I think you probably, as someone who's been in wellness and well-being for so many years, understand that when you put that to the side and you think, well, I'm just going to do diet and I'll be good with my diet, but I don't have time to meditate, I don't have time to go do yoga, that you do feel that something starts to get lost. And when you bring it back, it creates more balance in your body. And we know this, it translates into a healthier gut microbiome, reduced inflammation in the body. And that's why it's such an integrated and important part of any healing plan. And I incorporate it into the book with meditations and breath work that are specific for healing the gut, and the gut as the avenue to heal the entire body.
Love it, Vincent. Always a pleasure. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure. Again, thank you for having me.